Welcome back to Smarter Markets at IETA's North America Climate Summit 2024. I'm joined by Peter Zaman, our friend and partner at HFW in Singapore. Now, Peter, you've been busy at the conference. You've moderated a panel. You've been a member of a panel. What did you come to talk about this year at IETA?
Actually, it's the first time I'm ever coming to the North American Climate Week, so I've heard a lot about it. I've heard as well that a lot of the action takes place in the IETA forum, so hence I'm here. But in reality, I'm here because I'm not going to Baku. So, the practical reality is that when it comes to your choice of how you develop your BD budget, I think the question is, why would I go to Baku or why would I come here? I decided that Baku isn't really going to be that productive. That's my expectation in terms of how things will turn out. And therefore, I felt that the more useful thing to do would be come here and feel the vibe when it comes to US climate policy. Because there is a real challenge, I feel, coming up, particularly in the context of Paris Agreement negotiations, where the US's position on certain policy issues will be quite important. And we do have a very important election that's coming up just around about the same time as Baku. And therefore, the coincidence of those two dates mean that there's a real question mark around what position the US adopts come the negotiations in Baku. And it's almost a toss of a coin, given the closeness of where the election is. So I came here to get a better vibe for what would happen in either of the two scenarios that would follow from the outcome of the elections and what that meant for the rest of the world.
And what's the vibe that you've picked up so far?
I mean, the general theme that you get from the Trump camp is that they remain climate skeptics. And I think because I've taken the view that the Paris Agreement negotiations are no longer about climate, but it's about the trade, the global trade influences that follow as a result of the decarbonization agenda, that is consequential of the Paris Agreement. But because I've taken that view, therefore, the attitude towards trade is very important. And if you take the US Republican position on trade, well, you hear the rhetoric. We want more tariffs. We want more trade wars. We remain climate skeptics, but we're going to put America first. The Democratic view is different. They're much more involved in the concept of using markets. They remain supporters of Article 6, but the ability to convert Article 6 into a functional working mechanism, that requires a different kind of conversation than the one we're currently having. And I think the US position in that conversation, it becomes very important to ensure that what we get going forward from an Article 6 perspective is more functional than what we've been hearing so far. So I do think the outcome of the US election, it has a material effect on what we take away and benefit from by way of the outcome of Article 6. Also, in terms of the way US policy and European policy on climate differs. I've often, in conversations we've had previously on the podcast, described sort of the Inflation Reduction Act as a bit more of a carrot approach compared to the European approach, which is much more of a stick. So I do see that carrot and stick contrast has policy implications that put the US and the EU at loggerheads. And therefore, whether or not the EU have loggerheads in a pro-climate way or have loggerheads in an anti-climate way is really the outcome of what the election will determine. But one way or the other, the US and the EU are at loggerheads when it comes to policy.
And for people thinking about the election, which you said, it's still a coin flip. So when you're thinking about how do you manage risk if you're someone who's going to be active in carbon markets, trying to follow their own decarbonization agenda, and you're looking at this fork in the road, how would you advise people to think about, those two scenarios?
I think the difference that you get from the choice of the policy outcomes is reflected ultimately at some point in national legislation. So you only have to look at what's happened in the EU with its Green Deal legislative framework which mostly got introduced before the last European Parliament, but is now being implemented by the current European Parliament. And actually, the current implementing Parliament has a choice as to whether or not they go all in or they start rolling back a little bit. And actually, the message we're getting from the EU is that they are all in. So what you're going to get is implementation on steroids. And implementation on steroids mean that even things that are not necessarily completely ironed out are going to be steamrolled through, and therefore they're going to be left, they're going to leave the market having to figure out how to live with the consequences of that. We've seen that happen before, and it's never pretty, and the market always pays the price. And so I anticipate, at least from an EU perspective, a lot more of that. I think for the rest of the world, and I include the US in that, for the rest of the world, the question is always going to be, well, I hear the tune you are playing, but do I want to dance to that tune? And I think the choice of whether or not the rest of the world dances to that tune is very much going to depend on trade flows. And I think it's a real shift in trade flows that I anticipate happening over the course of the next 4 years, very much influenced by the outcome of the US elections, but also influenced by the way in which the EU have positioned themselves as requiring commodities and the supply chain to dance to a certain type of tune. And the real question is, does the rest of the world, in the way in which they have to meet the requirements for EU market access, accept that and take it on the chin? And I think that's the interesting thing that will play out in the next 4 years. So if I was advising clients who are in the commodity space, or I was advising clients who are looking at trade flows, the answer is always going to be, you've got to follow the policy drivers because they influence the investment that you put in today, for which there's a couple of years of investment return that you have to minimum think about. So if you don't have a 5-year, 10-year horizon, forward-looking horizon on how you're actually going to convert your investment into returns, and you don't anticipate the climate policy influence on that, then I think you are not doing your job properly.
And this is a much broader conversation on trade than you and I have had in the past. It's been more in the past about trade around Article 6 and carbon trade. So before you go, I just kind of wanted to ask you, the headlines this week, we've seen the US and Europe kind of aligning, trying to wrest some control over critical minerals away from China. When you're thinking about trade, is it around these commodities that are critical to decarbonization, or is it just a much broader realignment and kind of a rethinking of free trade? Just a small question before you go.
Look, I'll give you a small answer to try and help you actually respond to that. So it's a bit of an anecdote, but it's also something that I learned on my travels. So tin, right? I didn't know anything about tin as a commodity. It's not one of my commodity areas of strength. I know a lot about other metals, but not tin. What I didn't realize until I looked into it is that actually tin's considered a critical mineral by China, and it's considered a critical mineral by the US, but it's not considered a critical mineral by the EU. Now, oddly enough, tin was the best performing commodity in the first quarter of 2024, where its value shot up by about 25%. And when you realize that most of that demand is driven by China, you start asking yourself, well, what's happened in the last quarter to suddenly make that tin so important to the Chinese market? And the answer is electric vehicles. So if you think about it, electric vehicles have more computer components than traditional petrol-driven or diesel-driven cars. So what you're doing is, in the electronic circuitry, tin has a very important role to play as the solder of holding electronic circuitry together. This is a very pliable, malleable, and conductive and cheap material. The next effective one in a similar way is platinum, and you're not going to put platinum in your electronic tools. So essentially what you have in China is an electric vehicle surge, recognize the importance of tin, and demanding the supply and distribution of tin in a way that a lot of that is now moving to China. So the US recognizes it as a critical mineral, maybe for different reasons, but certainly we don't have an electric vehicle surge in the EU or the US. So at some point when that electric vehicle surge happens, they're going to realize they don't have any access to the tin that China has been sucking up. So at that point, the EU suddenly wakes up and realizes that actually we should think about this as a critical mineral. So I think to answer your question, the decarbonization agenda ultimately goes back to becoming a critical minerals and a supply chain agenda. And actually, China's got a head start on everybody on that. So we are going to see a lot of trade-related attempts to try and counterbalance China's head start. Basically, the rest of the world wants to penalize China for having foresight, right? And it's okay if that's the way you want to play it and that's what you want to do, and you can only punish yourself for your own lack of foresight. What are you going to do? That's kind of the way in which all the trade war and tariff wars are ultimately playing out. But when it comes to the carrot and stick distinction, and you're a producer or a supplier who's not in the EU and not in the US, your choices as to where you therefore supply become very much dependent on whether or not you're waving a stick at the person or whether or not you're giving them a carrot. And I think that's where the difference in climate policy becomes very important to supply chains.
Well, we'll have a whole lot to talk about with you in the future, but I'll let you get back to the conference for now. Thanks so much, Peter.
Thanks for having me.